This meeting is being recorded.
It's interesting that the good morning, everybody. It's interesting that that notification of this meeting is being recorded has a different accent on different people's platforms. Good to see everybody this morning. My name is Euan Leitch. I'm the Chief Executive at SURF, and welcome to this meeting of the 20-minute Neighbourhood Practice Network. Thank you for joining us in a meeting shortly before Christmas. Some of you may be about to celebrate your office or team Christmas parties. Not in this meeting. This is maybe not the most festive of events. But today we have two speakers. You've received the agenda for it, and also we have Jonathan Clarkson talking about work that's taking place in Perth and Kinross, and Chris Stewart talking about work that Collective have been doing for Glasgow City Council. And I was going to do close with a brief summary of what 20-minute neighbourhood, the policy context within National Planning Framework 4, the revised version of which came out on the 8th of November. We've made no further comment on NPF4 because it goes to before Parliament and it is a done deal. Whether or not they accept it or not, there's no, the amendments won't be accepted at this point, even if people have comments. There's been a couple of sessions with the local government committee within the Parliament looking at it, which has been looking at some detailed policy recommendations, but we know that the ministers respond to say there will be no more amendments being made to NPF4, but I'll maybe talk about that later on this morning. And so today, I think our last meeting, we heard from a few projects, one in Drimmen in particular, being a sort of locally driven project around transport within the Lomond Trossachs National Park. But also at that meeting, Jonathan Clarkson was quite active in the chat telling us about work that was taking place within Perth and Kinross. And so I went immediately to Jonathan, said, that sounds fascinating. I'm sure we'd all like to hear about this. So Jonathan, can I hand over to you this morning? I suppose before I do that, I should say to everybody, I've not done it because it's the usual drill. Put your, if you keep your microphone muted during the presentations, and if you've got any questions that come up during it, you can pop them in the chat. And if you want to raise your hand after Jonathan's spoken, Jonathan will be speaking for about half an hour, then we'd be happy to hear and see you. But if not, we're very happy to take questions in the chat, and I'll put them to Jonathan in our Q&A section in half an hour's time. So Jonathan, can I hand over to you and let you share your screen?
Okay, thank you very much, Euan. Is that coming up okay?
Yes, it is.
Okay, thank you. So, good morning, everybody. This morning I'm going to talk about the livable neighbourhoods kind of concept. The question really is it a concept applied, or is it healthy, sustainable places revealed? The badge in the middle there is the Perth and Kinross offer, which is really signalling a change in the way we go about what we do. I'll talk more about that a little bit later on, but I think it's important that we decide, are we going to keep doing business as usual, or are we going to change how we go about what we do and seek some of the opportunities within that? It's very heavily about sustainability, inclusivity and fairness, and I'll come on to that in due course. Okay, so a big thank you to SURF, first of all, for inviting us to speak here and to share some of this. I think these forums are fascinating because it allows us to share right across regional, different local authorities and a myriad of different communities, so that's welcome. Richard Boddington's talk last time was fantastic on Drimmen. It gave a really fantastic perspective in a rural situation, which matters, and have done some work in various rural communities, which I think is very different to city situations. Hussam did fantastically once again. How you can summarise the whole of urban design in the way he did, so articulately and well, was useful. And we've worked with and continue hopefully to work with staff and students there. Okay, and of course there's a myriad of great work on right across Scotland with local authorities and communities themselves. And we all know we're under significant resource pressure and constraint just now. Okay, so what I don't want to do is to have a kind of I am Spartacus. This is our view of 20-minute neighbourhoods, etc. And I certainly don't want to replicate what's been talked about previously by other speakers. So what we're looking to do really is to show what PKC, how we're interpreting that and how we're moving that forward pragmatically. Clearly, NPF4 is emerging, but we have to make some decisions post-pandemic, respond to that and move it all forward. Okay, so as a wee disclaimer here, first of all, this is pilot work emerging from the pandemic, also from the climate and the cost of living crisis, which are all fundamental at the top of people's minds and actions at the moment in Perth and Kinross, and I'm sure other places too. Okay, so it's not approved PKC policy, it's just a pilot which is developing what we're doing. The second thing is that it's a team effort. It's always a team effort, and we're collaborating across both teams internally, but also externally, and I'll come on to that a wee bit more shortly. Okay, so 3 important points to reflect. We think neighbourhoods seem to be more relatable in urban situations as a term. Rural places certainly are very different places. Second point is relationship-based placemaking, place shaping. It does take time, okay, because it's relationship-based. Completely agree, radical incrementalism is important. However, we're in a climate emergency, so I think we're going to have to accelerate some of that action. The third point really is the order of magnitude in addressing the predominantly 19th century urban sprawl movement patterns. I think we have to look at that in a different way. It has to be addressed and retrofitted if we know it's not serving us well. How we do that's a different issue and a challenge. Okay, so at one scale, perhaps neighbourliness is the most important aspect here, we think. Sharing and shared assets surely has to be at the core of all of that. Okay, so I'm going to talk in 3 stages really. Part 1 is really I'm going to focus on the process of what we're doing, because I think that's the answer is in some of the way we go about things. The second part is a sort of working example of how we're applying some of the stuff. So it's taking the theoretical into actual work on the ground, or close to being work on the ground. And I think that one of the questions I think we'd come to is the sum of the parts must be greater than the whole. Okay, otherwise we're just doing parts. It's not joining up, and that's what we're tasked to do. So what I'd question is neighbourhood the optimal part, certainly in a city and urban kind of context? The second thing I'll touch on is community of interest and community of place. We're working in community of place. That was a decision that was made because it's a little bit easier. You put parameters around that. Community of interest isn't excluded from that. It's a spectrum. It's not binary. And that's a simple way of saying, well, where are the biggest interventions going to be felt and made, and how does that impact on the wider network? So I know we can be criticized for this, but in some ways, making everything that we do more simplified, more relatable helps when we're working with various people from various backgrounds. If you take the overall planning process and the design process that we go through, you can reduce it back to a 2-stage process. Know the place and then nurture the place. Actually, that used to be know the problem, solve the problem, but that's not a fantastic way to go about working with local people in diverse, mixed and pretty amazing places. Okay, but process number 1, know the place. If you relate back to the work of Charles McKean, Wheatley, and so on in the studies of Dundee and the history of Dundee, have highlighted that, and I tend to agree with this, that when the changes were coming about to the way we planned settlements and changed settlements in the 1800s, there was, and the city improvement acts that were coming through in towns and cities across the UK. The first stage was supposed to be about know the place, know that understanding character of the place and the nature of the place and what that brought to bear. The second stage was then to come forward with concepts and proposals for change. But what we often do is move quite quickly towards the concept and applying concepts on places without fully understanding the richness, the variety, and the complexity of what we already have. And I think if we're going to change things, that actually doing more at the front end is a big opportunity. So experts don't start by already knowing the answer, and that's local experts as well as specialist experts coming in. They start by asking pragmatic questions such as what is the place? What is the place we're actually working with before we offer some change? Okay, so here we are. How do you deal with the huge complexity which is place? Here we're working in Perth. Perth sits within Perth and Kinross, and that has an important relationship with that wider context. And then the third element is that wider place, which is Scotland. I tend to split things into 3 parts to make it easier for me to relate to, but also make it more relatable for other people. And I think that really matters. Clearly the scales go up and they also come down a wee bit too. Okay, so taking some of the processes we go through, historic review, I think, is an inordinately important thing to do for all the reasons that I've highlighted, but also it's an opportunity to work with local people. So here's some of the earliest mapping we have for Perth. What's fantastically interesting here for me is that we've got lots of information on the east side of this map. Less information has been recorded at this point on the west. That's not to say that information isn't there, But it's curious, the one piece that has been picked up on is Perth as a place, okay, and the dividing element in that case being and connecting element being the River Tay. There's also St John's Kirk, which is picked up, and which is a shared asset, and the village and the community around about that itself. Okay, so what I want to focus on is that shared asset, that shared linking point. That's the raison d'etre, the reason for place being in this place originally. And I think that's fascinating. The second thing to pick up on here is relationship to place. There's a very faint echo on that map showing its relationship to something which is the watercourse round about the city of Perth. Okay, and that matters because place and people are intrinsically connected and relative to the surroundings, etc. So having a look at that, we see that becomes an interesting element to pick up on. Okay, so looking through the archive and the record, this is an illustration of what that medieval settlement may have looked like in the past. Okay, for me, what's really fascinating here is the street enclosure and the street pattern. You've got primary high street called the high street because it sits on high ground, it's pragmatic. St John's Kirk sitting in the middle there, street enclosure on South Street there, and then you can see that the plot and the rig patterns. Okay, that's creating enclosure for people, but it's also a response to climate, to place. Arguably, we've got bookends at one end down on the high street there, which is likely to stop the wind rattling all the way through. We've got the narrowings up at the top and the space in between, which is a place for people to meet together. And we used to spend much more time historically outdoors. Okay, so here's the water element coming in. This has now become in present day Canal Street, wrapping round to Caledonia Street, and then down to the Lade. The Lade's still there, but it's all predominantly underground at the moment. So that's still a feature of that local place, but that matters because of the underlying place, which is Perth. Okay, so there's lots of discussion around 20-minute neighbourhoods. Forgive the graphic there; it's a little bit fuzzy underneath, but I think you get the idea. Okay, this is an old money. If you put a dot in the middle of this place, which is Perth, out to the edges there, that shows you a quarter of a mile. Now, we know from research from the work of Richard Rogers, the Urban Design Task Force, Transport for London and so on, that that equates to roughly flat ground, about a 5-minute walk. Okay, 5 to 10 minutes takes you right across. So what we're suggesting is this was the scale of the settlement with a medieval core and then extending out to some of the medieval suburbs. I think that's interesting when you look at it in the 21st century now, because this is pretty much up to date. We now have a street grid pattern emerging. That wasn't underlying grid relating back to Roman origins. Actually, this is something that changed and was changing through the mid 1800s. So was this really the livable neighbourhood, or a 20-minute neighbourhood of old? Is it emerging from that local place, or is that something we're superimposing? I think it's actually something that was already there. The reason for showing these is it helps people relate to this idea, not as something superimposed from above, but actually emerging from the place which is. Okay, so these are some of the changes that were made historically. And again, this isn't a discussion about the history of the place per se. So there's lots more in this, but it's just to illustrate some of the changes that were made over time. What we've got here is the High Street, South Street, and the grid patterning opening up with proposals during the City Improvement Acts in the 1800s. Canole Street was a new street, and that's where you see the red kind of cutting through. That was an entire change to the movement, the connectivity in response to the conditions which were. That allowed for street widening in lots of places. The narrowings were expanded, they were opened up. The trams were allowed to come through to allow for rapid city expansion. The difficulty and a lot of what was addressed there were lots of issues to do with the underlying sanitation of places. We don't romanticize that, but we made some significant changes back in the day, and that brought some progress, but it has had significant downsides too in terms of places for people. Okay, so this is looking up the river. You're looking at a neighbourhood. The foreground, obviously, city centre. We've got the bridge crossing. The bridge is now moved up away from the high street and up to further up the river. So that's looking out to the neighbourhood, the part of Perth that we're looking at in particular at the moment, and then beyond into its rural hinterland and places like Lunkerty, which have a significant relationship with the city, both as a neighbourhood, but also as a strategic centre, which has dual functionality. So when I came onto the project about 18 months ago, I came on together with colleague Neil Moran, transport planner, and we were in the middle of a pandemic. The pandemic's kicked in. It's accelerated a lot of changes that were going on with regard to digital connectivity, and that matters because that was a significant change which was emerging anyway, but it's accelerated that change and that more local living. So we had city plan, which was close to kind of ground level in terms of scales of plans. We have a whole series of, this is a cycle master plan looking at corridors through the place. But what was possibly missing was the localism and the reality that transport corridors are pretty brutal in terminology. They're actually communities of people. Okay, so we're looking at the local outcome improvement plan, the community plan as it's called in Dundee, and that overarching value, which is the Perth and Kinross offer, and how we include more people in the process. So our developing methodology really allows for deliberative democratic process. Democratic process significantly matters here as far as we're concerned. And sharing the design process with folks, in our experience, actually works well. It helps people make better, more informed democratic decisions. And our particular project focus is fair, healthy, and sustainable movement, or as local people relate to it, they actually ask for livable neighbourhoods. That's their quote, not ours. Okay. So where do we start with a big complex project? Well, first of all, you start with what's strong. This was a graphic we've used with local communities to make the point really. And the second thing is how do you deal with that thing? How do you eat an elephant? Well, you do it in bite-sized chunks, and we think coming back to that's important. Okay, so we're now moving into the look at the area in North Perth that is our focus. We're looking at how we rebalance existing streets to take into account multiple uses, not just singular movement uses. These were two related projects which were going on at Dunkeld Road, but also at the same time working with Sustrans on a project for Balhousie Street. The pink area shows the sort of scope of that particular project in a sense. But what was missing at that point was this community up here. And this is a really interesting example of a Radburn layout superimposed concept on a place, actually in the floodplain, but all of the folk who live up here have a stake in what's going on within this place. So two projects overlapping with a shared potential for aligned governance. So we had to kind of hold the project for Balhousie Street to bring alignment together with, because we could see the shared benefit in that shared asset, which is the movement corridor and corridors, the movement system. Okay, so a quick look, how do we do it? We start with what's strong, not with what's wrong. Political context matters, going at the meeting with people, meeting elected members, meeting local folks, meeting community council people. We've got two active community councils here, but lots of community councils that are not active at all. And we've got a community up into the north, which is Lunkerty Community Council, big area, and they have a stake in this place too. We show these things called isochrones, which is a terrible term, but again, just to get a handle on the scale, what's going on within that, what's that catchment? And again, we have representative democracy, which is the political context we work in. But if we're going to change that, can we do something which is a little bit more deliberative and participative? Okay, this is a graphic I've used along the way, and we've again shared with people. Partly we have a choice. There are lots of different plans going on in any place at any one time. If we show the parameter, the catchment for that being 20 minutes, based on the discussion and the example we've shown, the pragmatics of place, we've got a choice. Do people want to come together with a shared baseline where actually lots of projects can be coordinated towards an overall goal, which is agreed by local and with local folks? Or do you want to have a situation where there are plans, lots of myriad different plans who don't necessarily coordinate and don't share that baseline? So they're all a little bit more vulnerable that way. The truth is you can have both. It's not one or the other, but this is a choice that we have moving forward. And the framework is really what we're looking to work with here. Okay, so we have this false dichotomy in my view, bottom up versus top down. Really, as my daughter would say, we can split it into three ways: high, middle, and detailed level. That's just a way to understand and work through that complexity. It's different levels of decision making. So we can talk at high level, international level, and national level, down into neighbourhood context. I think that's the big opportunity, or detailed level as we move into streets and more specific local interventions. This kind of subsidiarity meets devolution, both not great terms, but just to let people know the democratic decision-making is part of a bigger thing. We tend to think of and talk about top to bottom in the UK and the West. Actually, maybe we should set this out in a different way. Perhaps this is the ultimate shared asset here. This is what we all need to appreciate. And that means that decision-making works at the UN, all the way through to the EU, through to the UK, and all the way through round to local place frameworks. Okay, so some pragmatics here. So how do you deal with that? Well, we've got a number of different community councils with shared interest here in the shared movement framework. So we got people together. We set out quite clearly, because this is what they asked us to do, clear roles, responsibilities. So forgive me for putting a whole screen of information up in terms of words, but Core thing here was core values and clarity of roles, responsibilities, putting information on the table in a focus group of representatives, local elected members, as well as community councils, as a way of steering what we were doing. We set all of the information out so it's accessible. Again, this was asked for, and there's an awful lot of information there, but again, just splitting it into 3 parts, high, medium and low. We've got a lot of strategy at the moment. We've got medium level information, which is emerging, including things like place standard workshops, work with primary schools, secondary schools, etc. So what we're trying to do here is build a map of what we already have to see where the gaps are within all of that. And at the lower level at the moment, or that detailed level, that's a little bit light. It's a bit top heavy because the need at the moment is the more detailed level. Okay, so the way we go about it is actually we're dealing with a community in a neighbourhood that has somewhere between 5,000 and 10,000 folks. Having that conversation is tricky, and making sure it's inclusive is a significant priority. So on one side, what we're suggesting that we do is to make a representative cross section, because actually it's not about who shouts the loudest. It's actually reaching out and going into groups of different people, from young people who generally don't come along to open public meetings per se, and having more focused discussion where we have a better quality of discussion and based on information and experience. Okay, and we've just set that out in terms of life stages. So, you know, preschool, parents, grandparents taking young children to from school, school pupils through to secondary school pupils, differently abled people, minority groups, visiting people, because people coming to from an area have a stake in this place as well, business people, absolutely critical, and working people on a day-to-day basis. That's really what we're doing, because it's inclusive, it's pragmatic, and ultimately it's deliverable. The aim really here is balanced decision making. That's local experts working together with specialist experts. Okay, so we have different people at different life stages here. Then what we're looking to do is to actually share with them some of those different elements in that place, history, landscape, some of the implications for engineering, townscape, character. What is that place and why is that structured the way it is? And movement, which is our big focus. We brought all of that together in a simple report, and that's shared with people across the piece, which helps to build and strengthen trust. I won't go through this in full detail, but it's just a useful mechanism so everybody's clear about what the vision is, where the visions come from, and what our core mission is within our specific project, and what the outcomes are. And a lot of that's specifically health related. Going back to the sort of the expansion of settlements and the purpose of planning, a lot of it was to make places which are safe and healthy and sustainable for people. We've kind of sleptwalked perhaps into unintended consequences where cars are going faster and actually the pollution from that's a significant issue, and we need to do things differently. Okay, so part 2, this is a working example. We can't understand people without understanding context. I think that should be hopefully increasingly clear. And we can't understand place without understanding complex overlapping elements. That's our position with all of this. And the reason for that is because if you don't know, you increase risk. The more you know, the more you decrease risk. And if we can do more of that at a mid-neighbourhood scale, I think that's the big opportunity. And if we do that in a co-working way, that definitely helps strengthen trust and relationships and decision-making. Okay, the movement system is democratic and it's a shared asset. That's key. So the shared asset bit's the thing I keep coming back to. So these are the kind of graphics that we put up on the wall. We're saying, look, you can't understand Perth. It's an open system. You come in, you come out of. It's the nature of the place. Strong relationship with Dundee, both in terms of movement, commuting historically, although that's reducing a little bit, but and transfer of information to from. We do work with the university, etc. But of course, you also have a relationship. It was a market town originally. There's a tiered suite of different settlements here, and that matters too. People come to from. Its rural hinterland is significantly part of the place, which is Perth. Okay, so pragmatics kick in. We've talked about the neighbourhood centre, which is the city centre, but that's also unique because it's a strategic centre. That means people up in Lunkerty and out on this particular route have a stake because they need to get in, to and from. It's about movement of goods and people and services. So that changed it from being sort of the way it was originally conceived a little bit to being saying it's got to be about meeting the needs of people out with as well. And that means bus movement is significant. In terms of the actual area to define the neighbourhood, well, the River Tay is a significant element in that place. And on the other side, we've got railway lines. So that's where you see that the oval kicking in here. That's starting to define the parameters for the city centre and the neighbourhood that we're looking at of multiple mixed communities. Okay, so this is really just a quick look at the Dunkeld Road specifically. That's both a connecting element, but it's also a dividing element, and it's not a simple case of one or the other. It changes along its full length. The green area shows it being predominantly connecting element, but as you come into the city centre, the divisions across these neighbourhoods become more and more important. And again, what you start to see is where some of those hotspots are. And it's interesting when you overlap the pollution mapping, that air pollution mapping, some of those hotspots correlate and correspond. And of course, there's no point trying to cross the road across here to get to these beautiful green spaces round about, these beautiful services, and these absolute daily needs like hospitals, universities, if you've got a railway line dividing. So the context matters here. People know that, they realise that, but when you map it, you show it, it changes. It should change what we understand we're doing here, which is connecting people across a neighbourhood. Okay, so breaking the movement system down into three, primary, secondary, tertiary, it goes down, we know, a little bit more detail than that and probably a little bit higher than that, but just to make it relatable, this is a whole system. And as Daniela Meadows points out, or highlights, or the late Daniela Meadows points out, a system's only as strong as the whole system, not any single part of the system. And that matters because we can't look towards things like the hierarchy of streets and apply it on one street at a time. You have to see that as a whole system. It's slightly more complex. And we have to find a way through that. This is just to show that this is the kind of sketches and stuff that we do. It's not all finished, polished graphics. It makes it more relatable for people because anybody can draw like this. It's the thinking that's behind it that's important. So we were asked for the big picture by people. They wanted a sense of, well, how does this all join up? How are you joining the dots? This is some of the mapping on this particular area and its contextual relationship to some of the bigger moves going on. We've simplified it to aspirational unfunded project work. So the big red dot here actually came in later on through a process. This is purely driven by local people who have an aspiration to build a foot connection across the Tay. That's brilliant. We need to show that. That's relevant to what we're doing. Might be slightly out with our primary focus here, but that matters. It's aspirational unfunded. Most of them are on Amber at the moment, which is in design development. So that shows them what's going. Cross-Tay link roads are well underway at the moment, so that's happening. And then anything in green is it's funded, it's being delivered as we speak. Okay, so zoning in then in the neighbourhood per se, this is our particular focus. It helps us to manage projects which are correlated to what we're doing. And map where they are at any one point in time. This is just looking at predominantly the movement framework. This movement is a primary focus. However, project interdependencies matter too, and we have to have a way to work out what's in scope and what's out of scope. So we can do it, we have done it, and this has significantly helped local folks. Okay, so just relating that back, our key drive here is towards why do we have to get into cars and motorised transport in the first instance? Can we live better, more locally? Okay, you can't really look at the hierarchy of streets unless you see and understand that wider context and make that relatable for people. And of course, you have to actually go out there on the ground and see what's going on because topography matters, as does ability. Different people have different abilities, and that has to be taken into and factored into account. Okay, we can't do all of this movement thing without understanding where things are, where services are. And at the moment, an awful lot of them are in city centres. Rural communities need some more of these services to kind of feed in. So our project work won't deliver that, but we can advocate towards some of that and understand how it actually works at the moment. This is from some of the work that was done by the students up in Duncan and Jordan's College of Art, and there's a significant amount of learning we've gained from that. Okay, just a key thing here is where is the best place to put something if you're going to share it? The photograph here illustrated is probably in the middle. Okay, so relating this back, we had to be quite clear. Our project mission, our specific target here was movement, okay, and it was within the Dunkeld Road area. Okay, but we can't do that singular element without understanding all of these different values. And in a sense, that relates back to the economic case. Adam Smith focused on singular value, monetary value in some respects, or at least that's how it's been interpreted. But how do we bring in all of these other values too? Because they matter. So that's the processes that we've developed up, and these are the values that we've managed to work around, because all of that complexity has to relate to what we're doing, and yet we still have to deliver. Some of that actually just means going out with these two young adults who are from Perth College of Highlands and Islands. Neither of them were in a wheelchair, but going out and having some of that lived experience, that lived local experience helps us. So we learn as technical experts from local people with local lived experience. And just going out and actually doing some of that engagement on the streets, putting dots on plans, etc., that seems to be a really great way to reduce risks and to deliver better for people. So I'm running close to out of time at the moment, so apologies if I've rattled through that quickly. Here's one of the studies we've decided to bring forward to an earlier stage, and that's a preliminary ecological survey. Okay, there was some cost involved in doing this kind of survey work, but it gives you something more granular, more detailed than a local development plan, but not as detailed as a street level plan or as an intervention on a building or public space per se. But what's useful about this is that ecologists realize that the natural world doesn't sort of respect political boundaries. This is the real world as far as we're concerned, and we need to relate better to that. And likewise with water hydrology, etc. So this is one of the studies that's come out of the work we're doing at the moment, but the opportunity here is that we're sharing that across multiple projects so that other projects which are related to place and to place making gain from the process. So it's that shared baseline that I'm focusing on here. Okay, and equally, I've done some really great work together with colleagues, Katie Briggs, for example, in our local development plan team. They're taking this now. We had to move this forward in a pandemic. We didn't have the policy positions consolidated, so we had to make some judgments and move this forward. Now what's happening is that process is being tested and applied, and then it's relating back up into the development of the local development plan at the moment. Okay, so it's a two-way process. It's the grassroots informing some of the work at strategy, feeding back into a coordinated process across the whole city. This is using predominantly just an online technical resource, travel time mapping demo. And it's interesting because when you pop out a little dot in the middle of that and press the button, the metrics come out, and actually it shows pretty much what we'd understood to be local neighbourhood. That was a local understanding of neighbourhood together with local people. Okay, I will finalise in just one moment, but some of the earlier work I was doing with Perth and Kinross prior to coming on board in a local authority was with young adults. One of the focuses here is that our Euan is that young people and young adults have the human rights to have their opinions heard because they matter in shaping places. That absolutely is key to what we're doing. All people's opinions and views matter with all of this. But it also says that young people and children should be given the information they need to make good decisions. I think that applies to us all. We all need good information to make decisions at whatever age stage you're at. And this is where I think that some of the processes we're offering here can help to do that. So if knowledge is power, I'd come back to, would local neighbourhood data centres be helpful? I think the answer is probably yes. I know that colleagues up in Aberdeenshire, for example, and I think across in Angus too, are already looking at some of this, and how we curate that information, make it relatable and useful for people is going to be key to accelerating change. Okay, so change happens at the speed of trust, quote there from Stephen Covey. Few reflections, low trust conditions. I think we're all facing that a little bit at the moment, particularly with this thing called experts. But consistency of terminology may well help with that, particularly around the process to establish what neighbourhood is and how we get to that pragmatic understanding of place and neighbourhood as a kind of concept, and a governance mechanism as well, which matters. Okay, our approach at the moment, it's increased our social license to operate. That's not a written thing, that's just a relationship with local folks, elected members and so on. Co-learning is critical to all of this. Actually, it's about learning together about what we're doing. And then that has to be a collaboration between local experts and specialist experts. Okay, frameworks are a tool which we haven't invented. They come from others. CABE, for example, the previous CABE in England. It's a way of managing detailed plans like master plans. If you've got multiple plans going on, frameworks you're well advised to use as a way to kind of coordinate some of that. Okay, and that's got to be built on solid evidence for all the reasons that we've said. And that allows us to prioritize where you target interventions and changes to meet the greatest need. Okay, so shared neighbourhoods is a mid-scale survey. I think that's absolutely critical. I've said it before in this presentation, I'll say it again. That's absolutely critical, we think, to better quality decision-making and better quality process. That's the opportunity. Okay, and the potential to reduce consultation fatigue. If we keep having consultation after consultation or engagement on top of engagement, we're gonna, it's not the best necessarily way of going about it. There is a midpoint where you can actually do engagement work, which actually serves a number of different projects across a number of different departments, and it reduces consultation fatigue, we would strongly suggest. Okay, overall, they reduce risks. That's it in a nutshell. Life's risky. This is a way to reduce risk by informed decision making. And the last point, really, we really need to nurture and strengthen trust, because if we're going to deal with the climate emergencies, the biodiversity emergency, the cost of living crisis, the crisis of confidence in democracy, then I think that we need to work on that. And I think hopefully we've demonstrated with some of the work we're doing how we might do it. So forgive me, I think I've run over 5 minutes. I'm sorry for rattling through that too much. But the next bit's probably the most important bit, which is opening up for discussion with everybody that's here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. That was very interesting. And your concluding points were very pertinent, I suppose. I don't know if anybody listens to Darren McGarvey's week lecture, which I think was yesterday morning. I caught the beginning of it, which had some observations in it around who makes decisions and meritocracy. And I think some of the things you pointed out, the state that we're in is evidence of that. And also it was interesting that you said that one of the things that worked with the communities, the phrase that they were using that you were working with was livable neighbourhoods. But one of the things I wanted to ask you about, to talk a wee bit more about, was a local neighbourhood data centre. What do you mean by that?
So we have lots of mapped data at the moment, and it's coming in sometimes real time, which is interesting. But I think, you know, we're living in an age of information overload, and I think that how we curate that information is partly what local authorities particularly can help with. We don't necessarily have to do so much for local communities or do to local communities, but we can help them curate that information so that they can actually make well-informed decisions. I'm not a GIS expert by far, but we've got colleagues in GIS that can reveal all kinds of information within a place. But we have to do that in a way which is curated and relatable for local people. And it needs to be kept up to speed, kept on top of over time. So there has to be a refresh rate for some of this stuff too. But I think, once again, others from Aberdeenshire can probably speak to that better than I can. We're certainly keen to learn what others are doing on that front. But I think learning how to use some of that existing mapping and data is going to be key.
Okay, I ask because actually I suppose in my work, it's a consistent sort of complaint that data exists, but it's not always readily accessible. It's not always consistent, and it's not consistent across Scotland. So you get some local authorities that do have accessible data sets, but others that don't. If anybody has any questions for Jonathan, either raise your hand or pop them in the chat. Jonathan, you've obviously focused quite a lot about getting the governance right, but before I ask that question, Sarah Tolley has asked, she's wondering about how to secure local jobs with new roads, bridges, retrofitting. Will local people get a priority? Because I suppose employment in not necessarily what you're doing, but I suppose in what we're looking at in 20-minute neighbourhoods and separately community wealth building. Is that something that's coming up in your research?
It's coming up absolutely. I was at a meeting yesterday. I mean, dealing with tackling poverty is a key plank of what Perth and Kinross are looking to do. Just as a working example, I worked with the young adults on some of this research work early doors, and we were able to bring on board some of the students who are at the University of the Highlands and Islands to help facilitate some of the work that we were doing to engage other students in the high school, etc. And that's not paid employment, but it's really useful experience for them to gain. So they had an opportunity through what we were doing to be brought on board and to actually gain some skills and experience themselves. I think we can do a heck of a lot more of that. I think the way we procure a lot of this work needs to change as well. We've got local people in the local area that can do, for example, the work around ecology, habitat service, etc. We need to be doing procurement differently to bring on some of that, so we're actually meaningfully adding to that. And of course, at the heart of all of this work, we were focusing on movement, particularly taking into account all those other issues. Local place plans or local place frameworks have to look at those other assets too. So one of the assets that we have at the moment is Balhousie Primary School. That's about to next year go, it's becoming redundant as a primary school. That's being consolidated in a new school up in the north part of that area we're looking at, the neighbourhood we're looking at, in North Muirton, in a passive house school, actually, which is quite interesting. And that's going to change how people move. But here we have a school and an opportunity. So that's something that's being looked at from that whole systems approach to understand, well, what does that mean within that local place? Well, if we've got that baseline that's already mapped and understood to that neighbourhood scale of understanding, then you understand what that is relative to other things going on. So there may well be business opportunity, there may be mixed use, or there may be housing use or need within all of that, or it could be that the whole asset's transferred to a local development trust, and they choose to decide how they take that whole thing forward. So it overlaps, but it's quite tricky. I mean, we're working in at this scale. It's complex. We know it's complex, but we have to have the humility to say, well, how do we tackle it? And mapping it in the first instance, coming back to your point about information, I think is absolutely key to that, to be able to make informed moves.
In the decision made around school consolidation, that presumably, does that predate the work that you're doing?
Yes, it does. So everything's changing all of the time. That's the only constant. So it's quite, there's lots of moving parts, but we have to map it and know that it changes all the time. So you have to refresh, quite often with some of this stuff. But all of them, you can't look at, a school, for example, and detach that from movement. All of these things have interrelationships.
And does the movement and does the repositioning of the school, do you think that consolidation, at the point at that time that decision was made, was movement considered as part of that as to why they would consolidate it? Or because I suppose if you look back to some of the, as you travel around Scotland, you can go to a lot of settlements where new schools were built within the past 10 to 15 years, all on the edge of the of a settlement, which in some ways, yes, it's space, but it has often removed activity from the town centres. And I don't know if, do you think that would have affected, would the same decision be made today that was made?
Well, what I'd say is I completely agree with that. And I think speaking to you from South Queensferry, we have exactly that as an issue. However, I'll not go into that one. This isn't a new school being built. It's an existing school in North Muirton that's being consolidated and changed. So there's already a school there. Your point about location is still relevant. Ideally, you'd want to have things built in sort of centralized locations. I think movement has been considered, but what I think we have to watch out for is the risks, because if we just work with what we've got, we're potentially consolidating division between different areas. The really great strength of bringing two primary schools together is you've got a catchment across a whole neighbourhood, and I think that means that you're bringing people together. The risk in not doing it and approaching the way we've approached it is that you've got two different communities with different demographics and different priorities, and that's a great thing. But the risk is that you don't bring that, you consolidate condition rather than bringing people together to share. And I think so. There are pros and cons to it, and it's not an ideal world. We know that. I don't know if that really answers your question.
No, it does. But Michael Ward, you have your hand up and has a question for you.
Yeah, I'm interested in, I suppose, where there's I'm Michael Ward. I work in Glasgow City Council, so you've obviously got the complexity of communities within communities. So you have very local communities, but you obviously have a community that is the city. And I was at a meeting yesterday in a local community, which is a mix of officers and local residents. And there was an interesting discussion in the first 10 minutes about how none of the local cafes are open at the right times and they're not serving the local community, and they maybe don't have enough customers. And then the next 10 minutes was the community railing against a development that had been approved in a car park, a kind of high density town centre urban development, which will bring more customers and all that sort of thing. So there was a view expressed by the local community that there's not enough car parking in the town centre, but the community of Glasgow has agreed a direction of travel that we're looking to reduce dependence on the car and car park and all that. So it's that sort of complexity of, you have a very local community within a much bigger community, and Glasgow sits within a Scottish context where we have, we're focusing on development in town centres and increasing density and a kind of more sustainable urban forum. But when it lands very locally, the local people, largely community council people who are a bit older and maybe rely on cars to get to the shops and stuff like that, they're sort of saying, no, we would rather have a car park than that housing. So how do you kind of mediate between those different communities' needs, if you like?
Michael, it's a fantastic question, and I relate to all of it. I think what we need to understand is these are wicked problems. That means that they're not polarized. It's right, wrong, black, white. We've got to see the issue in the round. And I think to share that and to show that and to bring that nuance to some of the discussion is a useful thing to do. But we can't have tomatoes being fired across fences. That's not helpful. We should be mutually respectful enough to say it's okay to have lots of different communities, either of interest or spatially. That's enriching. But what we do need to do is have a better quality of debate about how we make decisions, not just for us selfishly, but for us collectively. Now, I really don't mind what everybody chooses to do. That adds hugely to our diversity, richness, and resilience ultimately. But there are some key things, and I think we should simplify the whole planning system down and say, is it actually going to be healthy and sustainable? Now, we know how important movement is for people from a physical perspective. We know, I mean, the world's biggest killer, I think, at the moment is air pollution, if I'm not mistaken. But it's not seen, it's not obvious from cars. So when you start to map that and you share that with people and you show them good process, it becomes less polaric between it's right or it's wrong. I mean, we'll still have to get to that ultimately in some situations, but that's what our elected members' role is to do. They have to ultimately, make those decisions. The only thing I think we can do from a design perspective and from an advisory perspective, process is to share good process to make it less black, white, right, wrong, and that's a challenging thing in our social media world that we've created. So I empathise, I understand that, but the best I think we can do is exactly the process we've just described, where we share with that decision-making process some of the pros, some of the cons, and some of the stuff we're not sure about.
Thanks.
Does that help? I'm obviously aware of the community discussion that Mike was talking about, and I know that it is heated. And I suppose it also does come back to who is representing the community in those discussions, who may have set ideas, and it comes back to, I suppose, some of the communities that you engage or others have engaged with in Perth, and it taps into one of the other questions that has come into the chat from Anthony McGuinness, which is talking about young people being involved, and he's asking about how much say in the decision-making process do they have, and how did they find the engagement process? What was their feedback?
Well, I'm slightly prejudiced here because I was a consultant at the time working with PKC, but that was our role. We specifically went into young adults. We worked very closely with them. I'm very happy to share that report with anybody who's interested. So I think that they were definitely involved in that. That was a key, and it remains a key requirement. Inclusivity is absolutely, essential for fairness with regards to the work that Perth and Kinross are doing. But it comes back to the representative cross-section. Just to have everybody in a village hall, which is arguably representative democracy, it's often who shouts the loudest. People like me who are, more articulate or have an ability to speak, it's fine. But actually, there's quieter people with different perspectives that are equally valuable, if not sometimes more so. So how we do that is the thing that I think we need to change. So that representative cross section is definitely a way to bring them in, and that will inform the process. But if we're measured just on quantitative assessment rather than qualitative process, then it's going to be challenging to get to where we need to be. We need politicians and others to realise that if we're going to do democracy differently, it's almost like kind of mini citizens' assemblies. We're gathering a better quality of information to inform it, because everybody in one room isn't inclusive. It might seem inclusive on the surface, but it is just that. And it's not to say one thing's right and one thing's wrong. We live in a representative democracy. That's a great thing. But this is a way to enrich that democratic process. Just to finalise on community councils, if we're serious about developing local democracy, then we need to put some resource towards that, because at the moment it's largely people who are time rich who can go along. Now, I've served in a community council for a couple of years, but this is a few years back now, and that was pretty rare. And there are some that have got more local, younger people involved in them, but that definitely needs some work to make that, I think, actually more morally representative, not just statutorily representative. Because at the moment, community councils are representative statutorily, so in legal terms, even though there's a clause in their the rules for community councils that says they have to have an election, they just don't have to have a ballot, is my understanding and advice from DTAS. So I'm thinking, well, if we're going to do this seriously, yes, governance matters, but also using, for example, the resource for particular projects like movement can help address some of that inclusivity by going out and reaching into, gypsy travellers, visitors to the area, etc., businesses, etc., because people respond in different ways in different situations. And I think that's a great way to reduce the risks in not including young people, for example, to come back to Anthony's question.
Okay, I mean, these are interesting observations, and I think it taps in with some wider discussions. And I suppose actually thinking back to what Michael said, the city urbanists, Glasgow city urbanists, recommend one of the recommendations for them is having people working within communities long term at all times, and that they are there to work within the community. And it's all the suggestions that have cropped up all the time, and SURF have connections with the community, with CDAS in community development. And community development has kind of shrunk in Scotland,
yes.
But actually having people working with communities also reduces the need for what you refer to, Jonathan, as over consultation, because I think
yes,
one local authority that we talked to, they looked at the fact that they had consulted a community 17 times in 2 years, 2 to 5 years, but different parts of the local authority had. So there wasn't they weren't taking community engagement in a kind of holistic way. They were doing it in a very piecemeal way. And while we're all supportive of community engagement and participation, it's still there. We haven't cracked that nut. I don't think in doing it in a way that means people don't become exhausted, and because people want to see outcomes if they're asked a question, they want to see that they've been listened to, and they want to see a change taking place, and that is maybe the thing that results in the lack of trust that you also referred to.
So the situation that is general out there in the last number of years is that we tend to come up with the answer. Here's the answer to now. Here's the concept. Now remind us, what was the question? What we're trying to do in Perth and Kinross is flip that and say, actually, let's have more time actually working out what the question was, where the needs are, so we can target that better and involve more people. And that's now. I mean, Perth and Kinross are working pretty hard with a whole team and across teams. In terms of starting with what was strong, when I came on board, the first thing I did was reach out to people in community development who had embedded officers with existing relationships in that place. And they were like gold dust, because it helped, with relationships. If we can't just move to a transactional model, which is run through an algorithm on a computer database to decide what a neighbourhood is, it's got to be a close working relationship with, if we're going to strengthen trust and strengthen local democracy and reduce decision making in a way which targets limited resource to best effect. We don't think our process with all this is perfect, by the way. It's far from it. It's always going to be a little bit messy, but we can do, I think, a lot better if there's the will to do it. And come back to the Perth and Kinross offer. That's what the Perth and Kinross offer was all about. And that's what Perth and Kinross are working really hard at the moment to try and operationalise. Well, that's a terrible term.
Okay, Jonathan, thank you very much. I'm going to draw the discussion to a close. Sarah Tolley, you have a question about services within 20 Neighbourhood, which we might come into actually with Chris's presentation and with mine towards the end. But Jonathan, thank you very much for giving that overview. And I think it'll be interesting to see how things pan out in Perth and Kinross around this specific project. And we may come back to you in a year or so's time to see actually what are the results looking like for the project. But thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you all.
I'm now going to suggest that we take a quick comfort break and come back into the room at 11. See you then. Thank you very much. Thank you again, Jonathan, for your presentation. And we are now moving from Central Scotland and Perthshire to Glasgow. And I'd like to introduce Chris Stewart from Collective Architecture, who's been doing some work for Glasgow City Council on their Livable Neighbourhoods project. So Chris, can I pass over to you?
Yes, certainly. I'm going to try and share my screen, which I'm very bad at. I'm put my apology in straight off. I'm just recovering from a very bad cold, so if I cough and splutter my way through this or look a bit faint, please understand. Right, share. Now, is that working?
That is working. We can see it, Chris.
I just need to get it to go, don't I?
You do.
Do that. Slides. How do I do that?
If you go to File, if you click on File, I think.
Oh, no.
Nope, not that. You're looking for.
If you go to slideshow at the top bar.
Ah, yeah.
There you go.
That's it.
Okay, right. Thanks very much. Okay.
That's it.
Right, I'll just get into this then. Well, it's very, very interesting listening to that conversation at the end and reading the clips in the chat bar, because specifically what I was asked to do, I was commissioned we were commissioned, Collective Architecture commissioned through Arcadis. We work with Arcadis by Glasgow City Council to look at livable neighbourhoods, but our kind of role was very much to do with the community consultation. And so what I'm going to talk quite a bit about is the way we did approach community consultation and the way we approached livable neighbourhoods as part of that team was to find ways of finding grassroots projects and using those grassroots projects to develop a strategy. So it was very much a bottom-up approach, and that was specifically what we had to do. So I completely understand when people say that there's people are fatigued with consultation. That is very much the case. But just to tell you a little bit about, the Glasgow City Council has done a tremendous amount of work, some great work on livable neighbourhoods. But they do have 4 kind of key themes that we focus on, and that's local town centres, everyday journeys, active travel, and street for people. Won't dwell on these because I understand that everybody's now having watched the first presentation. I understand people are well on the way to understanding what 20-minute neighbourhoods is all about. So I won't dwell on each of these, but I think very much local town centres became really important to us, as did everyday journeys, as we went through our process of trying to figure out how we've very much taken a bottom-up approach, that we developed strategies for some parts of Glasgow. Now, Glasgow is obviously it's our biggest city, and perhaps there was an emphasis on Perth and slightly more rural approach, but Glasgow is a huge city, and it's been broken up into 24 parts, perhaps with a focus on the way the wards work and the way the constituencies work. But you just have to find a way of breaking up such a big city, and how you then start to approach considering the livable neighbourhoods within each of these. Now, the first tranche took 4 areas into consideration. They're the 4 that are kind of highlighted, and we were asked to look at 2 of these, and one being the sort of inner southwest area of Glasgow, which is kind of Govan, Ibrox, Kingston, Shield Hall, Lighthouse, and the other being the kind of inner northeast, which is Denniston, Haghill, Ridley, Carntown, Crownhill. Each of them huge areas, and each of them, it was interesting listening to Michael, each of them have that relationship to the centre of Glasgow, where obviously key activities already take place, and perhaps 2 of the more kind of inner parts or quarters of our city, but of course they stretch huge distances, and they do tend to stretch east and west, as you can see. But how exactly do you then go about thinking about areas so big, and how start to break that up? So this was almost the first task that we had to kind of like combat, was the areas already were quite vast, and how do we actually start to think about how we break those up into communities? I mean, these, and it was interesting to think about Michael just talking about communities within communities. That is very much the case in these 2 areas. And in the top one, you've got the kind of inner southwest, and there's just some examples. And they're also like, you can see there's Elder Park, Govan, Cessnock, King Park. I mean, these are all some examples, and within each of these, there's sub areas and different ways the communities work and link together. And it's also very much that we didn't want the boundary, and that was not our brief, that the boundary wasn't set. We had to, how do these areas bleed into the other neighbourhoods? You just can't think of them in complete isolation, although you have to find a way of breaking down this kind of thought process. And each of these areas has massive infrastructure, which act as major physical boundaries to them. I know it's Jonathan talked about a railway line, but in these areas we have the M8, for example, which is just a huge, massive physical boundary, which has completely devastated portions of these communities. And in the Govan area, we have the Clyde, albeit there's several bridges proposed around there, and several bridges have been put in. Again, it's a big boundary, but also a big opportunity. And in some ways, how we treat the M8 is a big opportunity in our northeast. We have the M8 again to the north, acting as one of our kind of boundaries. And to the south, we have the mainline railway, which runs, from Glasgow Queen Street to Edinburgh Waverley, and that well, one of the main lines is there's a couple, and that again acts as a major physical boundary, but we have to find ways of overcoming those. So hugely complex areas, and somehow we have to try and find a way of breaking them down. So the first way we start to do is just to start to think, and there already was historically, these areas had some identities, and this is the northeast we're looking at. So we did break it down into 5. Now, these were because there already were some core identities or neighbourhoods that already existed, and they ranged dramatically in the way that they're kind of made up. There you can see the 5 that we picked was Denniston, Hag Hill, Ridgely, Carntine, and Cranhill. Can't see Cranhill because of whatever these photographs over that part of the picture, but all quite different in their way. I mean, Denniston is quite tenementally well built up, and Hag Hill is a bit of a kind of difficult area that's been broken and affected by urban development over the years. Whereas Carntine and Ridgely, things start to get quite suburban, and then Cranhill, we're back into peripheral estates. So there's a right wide variety of the just general fabric, urban fabric of these areas to be able to think about. But the idea was that each of these did actually, and I hate using the word 20 minutes, but these roughly were coming into 20-minute walking distances. So that was an easy way for us to start to think about it. So the aim was then to we'd have an event in each of these 5 areas where we invited the local community to get together and speak to us. And also we then had a final event where we brought all the local communities together as one and talked about the ways that we found out. And of course, in each case, we were looking to bridge some of these boundaries that had been set with us, for like the M8, for example, and that tended to work with the catchment areas for schools, for example. So we had to think long and hard about the way that we spoke to the areas. The Greater Govan area was just as complex, if not potentially more complex, because they have within these areas this huge physical barriers and huge major kind of pieces of infrastructure, such as major hospitals, where the rest of the city or even the rest of the region tend to use. So in this case, we broke it down into 5 areas, as you can see here. And in each of these 5 areas, we then were able to gather the local communities together and have an event and discuss what they thought livable neighbourhoods might well be. And in each case, we would try and get across some of these boundaries which exist, like there's the Clyde to the north, for example, and there's obviously connections that exist from perhaps Cessnock to Finnieston, and likewise across the M8 itself to the south. And we kind of do know that some of the school children do have to cross some of these inhospitable pedestrian bridges across the M8 to perhaps go from Cessnock to Bellahouston Academy, which is actually on the other side of the M8. So it's a hugely complicated kind of area, but we had to find ways of tackling the task that we've been set in speaking to these different communities and finding out what they thought. And how do you go about that? How do you actually go about that in areas where, I mean, Govan, for example, is probably, I don't know, I have no statistics, but I'm guessing it's one of the most kind of consulted areas in the world, never mind kind of like Scotland. I mean, they're constantly having consultation events and trying to gather some enthusiasm. And by the way, this all happened during the COVID pandemic as well, perhaps about a year ago. So we had to somehow tackle that process through there. So how do you actually go about engaging? And the way that we went about and we've done a lot of this kind of work, was to actually get involved the local groups that already existed. What we're looking at here is the Carntine walking group, and I used to go every week. I still go and join them every week. I will go for a walk around the Carntine area, and likewise in the Govan area, I would go for walks with their local communities and groups as well. And they would just take me to the places where were important. They would just take me to where the grassroots projects already existed. Now, while at the same time, these areas of Glasgow are perhaps over-consulted, they are absolutely rich in local activity and rich in local projects. So in some respects, this almost like helped us tremendously. These already existed, and we were already able to use these because they had a sense of importance, and we were able to use these then to kind of like set up the kind of events that we would have, and we made sure to invite all of these kind of local groups that were involved. So it was a lengthy process, but it was a seriously enjoyable process. But of course, we went through a couple of lockdowns as we went through that as well, which made things pretty difficult too. That's the Quarantine Walkers, a fantastic bunch, took me to some very interesting places. But then we would go about how we approach that, and we approach that very much in a way of massive floor maps and lots of coloured building blocks. And we would speak with the community and find out where were all these grassroots projects, where were the important things, where were the difficult areas, and we would build up ideas with them. And these are just some examples of some of those events that we would have. Very informative, and we just discover so much. Obviously, you know, I'm dealing with the community side of things, but of course we had, you know, active travel experts, we had urbanists, we had economists, also all looking at this and how all of this actually might equate its way back into well-being, and actually form a calculation to show how these projects actually would actually bring so much improvement to there. So there was a lot of that, but the real focus was these grassroots projects, and these grassroots projects and how they emerged, and actually could dovetail and coordinate with the wider city strategies which were happening as well as we went through these conversations with the communities. And there's also a Commonplace website which ran in conjunction with it as well. So there was an opportunity for everybody. It was lockdown, so there was an opportunity for everybody to engage online. And you know, we did get over 5,000 comments on these, so there's an awful lot of input to that, but we're also acutely aware that not everybody is tech savvy, and I put myself into that category. So these kind of in-person events were really very, very crucial. And we gathered information, and these are just some examples of it, and how we had isochrones as well, that we kind of like knew where all the doctor surgeries were, where all the bus stops were, and we were able to overlay these. These are some of these own that we would build up. So we would even just ask people where they actually thought where Govan community was, and with quite a range of differences that people would actually have to actually think what was their neighbourhood. We would discover where these barriers existed within the communities, and where we needed to find ways to actually access or break things down. I mean, for instance, here we're kind of looking at the Ibrox-Cessnock area, which people immediately think is naturally attached to the Pacific Quay. It's not. There's some major barriers between Cessnock and the Pacific Quay, so you can't even enjoy some of these kind of larger citywide attractions that kind of exist that are actually on their doorstep, and naturally the M8 is a huge barrier, and physically, and it's very, very noisy, for example. So we had to look for all these. But what we were able to do, and this is just like 1/4, this is where we were able to do, was to discover where all the opportunities did exist from the local communities. And these would be quite very informative. I mean, even down to the extent that we would start to discover areas that we could develop low traffic neighborhoods. I mean, even like this is actually looking here at perhaps the kind of Shield Hall kind of area, but you know, all of a sudden it became obvious that there was perhaps 3 local schools actually in close proximity to each other, and there's a real opportunity there for find easy ways for school children to travel to school in a kind of safe manner and develop a low traffic neighborhood. I'm not going to get involved in too much of the technical aspects of what low traffic neighborhoods exactly are, but this ground roots up approach to finding out what people need really did work for us. So we were able to then gather all of these. I mean, it did mean that we were getting hundreds and hundreds of potential projects coming through this kind of process, but we did then have to find a way of actually breaking that down into perhaps what ways of measuring them, and the measurements would relate to health, carbon, cost, all these kind of things we would have a look at and find ways to bring that a massive long list and start to bring it down to short list. That did not mean that the those other projects were then disregarded. Of course, they still remain very important, but we needed to find ways of finding some which we could perhaps then find a way of looking at in a bit more detail, and we find ways of doing that. And then what we would do then is we would go and we would perhaps have more focused conversations with some of the communities around some of those ones that we thought were worth looking at in a bit more detail. And this is working with Smithy Croft Secondary School in Ridley, which sits right next to Barlinnie Prison, and how that actually working with the children there and how the ideas they came up with, which were just fabulous. And we were able to take their ideas and build them into some initial ideas and some initial kind of thoughts. These are just some of the models that the children would come up with, which are just fabulous and inventive. And I realize that people may think some of these are perhaps aspirational, but they really are strong starting points for us to think to how we can start to find ways of turning these into reality. And so we, of course, we built up strategic master plans where we brought what we felt were the most important of these grassroots projects and how they actually would link into more important and meaningful routes that the city is also looking at in terms of like avenues and where might there be important routes through, and perhaps where metros might end up being positioned, and also where railway stations are, etc. Both areas that we looked at cried out for a new railway station, which actually found their ways into our thinking. One obviously being at Parkhead and the other at Ibrox. So immediately there seemed to be a way of bringing the city together in these two kind of potential locations for railway stations. And then we realized these are so there's some seriously big thinking coming out of these kind of processes, because this also has an impact on match day. Where these two major kind of like football teams have an impact in the local area, but they also work very well with other kind of potential routes and opportunities that we did look through. And that they were looking at some of the ideas that did come up from the northeast area, and as I say, these would find their ways across some of these major infrastructures. Structural barriers that we kind of like were aware of, such as the M8. It's because the M80 there, but that's the M8. Or that might be the M80 that's strong there. And that was important to us because there was obviously ways of finding, linking up Cran Hill with the 7 locks and all the wildlife that sits there to the north of the city. And there's also ways of finding ways that Denniston could find its way and link through to Belgrove in the east end of Glasgow. As you can see, my voice is starting to go a bit, so I'll move on a bit faster. And likewise, in the Greater Govan area, we were able to find a whole series of grassroots projects and find ways actually of linking these together and developing them. And we were able then to take a few of these projects and start to think about them in a bit more detail. One of them, for example, was a space or an area in Carntine, which we were able to start to develop into a local town centre, and that obviously sits adjacent to Edinburgh Road, which is likely to be one of the major kind of like active travel and metro routes into the centre of the city, and how they could actually turn a redundant space and develop it into a local town centre, because that's the big thing in Carntine, was that they did not have a local town centre. There was a dearth of local amenities, and that was probably the biggest thing that they were looking for, was somewhere where they could actually get together and actually have some local shops and the like, and build up a local town centre. Likewise in Cessnock, fantastic opportunity going along the Cessnock strip to actually develop a local town centre. Likewise, and then moving on again, finding ways of discovering these links that perhaps Jonathan was talking about, and around between Denniston and the Belgrove area, there's several redundant railway bridges, which are serious areas of serious antisocial behaviour. I'm talking really serious antisocial behaviour that you would not want to walk across these bridges. And we were able to discover how they were interlinked, and ways that we could actually form these active travel routes running. In this case, you're looking at the White Veil Bridge, and also the is it the Belgrove Bridge? That actually links Denniston down to St Mungo's Secondary School. So the children use this, and it's just as an area that's used for selling drugs, basically. So this actually has to try and deal with some serious antisocial behaviour. Ways of getting active travel routes through parks which are just literally redundant, and finding ways to actually join up areas, in this case going through Hogarth Park down in a old redundant railway line, and finding its way down to the Parkhead Forge, and how we can actually put that to use, rejuvenate these parks, but also suggestions that would be the potential position for a new railway station, which the area badly needs. So it's quite big thinking, but these ideas they're coming from the grassroots, but they also are significant, and they actually do work very well with a lot of the kind of larger scale kind of thinking. Drumroyne, how can we actually create a low traffic neighbourhood? Because we did discover that in this area there was a lot of schools that already kind of exist there, so trying to find safe ways for the children to get to school, and we did have workshops with the local schools to discuss how we actually did that. And in this case, is again just an area that we could find ways of improving, finding better ways into parks, better ways of linking the Cessnock community back to the Clyde itself. There's the Clyde mission, and how do we actually find a way to communities to actually get to the Clyde and enjoy what is probably our most significant asset. And in this case, there's a park where, again, the serious antisocial behaviour happening in that park is just it's a matter for the police. But there was ways that we could actually find of linking an existing school, the Lawrence Street Primary School that exists there, using the spaces in front of it, which were major cycle networks go right through. And again, these are ideas that the community completely want to see happen and understand that this is where the problems are. So we find ways of creating a new park entrance into that park and rejuvenate it to somewhere that's actually nobody goes, to actually somewhere that people will go. And I stuck that in the end because it's a slight little bit of showing off, but with Glasgow City Council, we're very pleased that they actually won the community consultation, did win the Landscape Institute Award 2 weeks ago in London for the community engagement category. So it actually did win that award. I wasn't there, but we were very pleased about that because it gives some power to our elbow. But again, yes, I completely understand the way the conversation went earlier on, and that yes, it's really hard to continue to engage with some of these communities. And as I say, these are 2 quarters of the city which already does attract a lot of attention. and there is fatigue, community fatigue there, but it's important then but if you're going to engage, I mean, people need to realize that things will happen, and this is not just simply a tokenistic approach, and also that it has to be meaningful, and the ideas do have to come from them, and it's not just a tick box process we're going through. So it was hard to do that, but again, by focusing on the existing communities that already exist, and the existing community activities which are already happening and are also a clear signpost as to what's important, we used that as a means to starting to bring engagement and community ideas into our proposals. So I'm going to stop talking there, and I'm going to stop sharing. Hope that was helpful. I'm still struggling away.
Thank you very much, Chris. I can hear it in your voice, but thank you very much for sharing that with us this morning and for sharing the work that you've done in Glasgow. One of the first questions we had was from David Lees, and it was regarding, I suppose it was actually looking at how you've segmented broken down some of the large areas that you're looking at. And he's asked is how closely the areas relate to the SIMD wards.
A wee bit. There's a wee bit of it. But I think in perhaps the only area I can think of is maybe, I don't know. We did have a look at that in the reds and blues and the way they kind of work. But I think in some of these areas they are really very red. I don't think there was any blue in the Govan area at all. There might have been a smattering of blue in Denniston. I'm not altogether sure, but if that's what David Lees is talking about, is just the levels of social deprivation. Is that right? About this right?
Yeah.
Both areas were pretty red, so there wasn't there. If you actually just went to the north, on the other side of the Clyde Tunnel, then which the Clyde Tunnel, again, a piece of infrastructure which is part of ours, it will get very blue very quickly. But and I can see Michael's popped up. He probably knows more about that information than I do, and he perhaps answer that. But these both areas of social deprivation.
I think my understanding is correct that some of this work is funded through Sustrans, similar to the work Jonathan's doing, and so it's quite I suppose physically focused on the focus on movement and barriers to movement. But I suppose in the wider 20-minute neighbourhood concept, which, coming back to some of Sarah Tolley's questions around what can be provided within a 20-minute neighbourhood, in the engagement of communities, where was service provision brought up as something that was absent, or they were dissatisfied with the quality of service provision, be that health, schools, shopping, things like that? Was that something that came up at all?
It did come up, because what I didn't show is there was a lot of isotones. I can never quite get that word, and that did explore schools, and that did explore doctor surgeries, and it did explore where pharmacists were and all that kind of work. There was some areas, strange enough, there was some areas where there wasn't decent secondary school provision, and that did kind of throw up that. But I think it was the local town centres which kind of like really were thrown up as something that was completely missing. And again, that's very hard, because what exactly is a local town centre? But they were badly missing in the kind of Carntown Ridgery area, and that really threw up that was an important aspect that we had to look at very closely. And likewise in the Greater Govan area, again, that was kind of thrown up as something that was kind of missing, that perhaps Govan was categorized as a local town centre, but the other areas, and that there was a kind of bones of one at Cessnock, it definitely needed boosted. So they were the kind of aspects that these isochrones threw up. But I mean, the areas were reasonably well served by public transport, except rail. And some of the railway stations that did exist in the Denniston, Hag Hill area, the railway stations didn't have DDA compliant access. So there actually was no way of actually getting down to some of these railway stations, like Belgrove, for example. It's just stairs. There's the only way to get down to these railway stations are stairs. So it had some of its its problems. And they had parks, but unfortunately lots of parks, but some of these parks were so inhospitable that people just would not go into them. So that there was all of potential there in terms of schools and hospitals. They seemed reasonably well served in these terms of things. But it was having a local town centre was probably the biggest thing that we found that was kind of missing in these areas. And you had Duke Street and Alexandra Parade, and we had Govan Town Centre, but the other areas really, really lacked that. And that's where the big focus was, building up a local town centre in Ridley, building up a local town centre in Cessnock. And they were two of the projects that we kind of did think about an awful lot. So, and
I suppose that reflects sort of frequent criticism of post-war development that we saw in Glasgow around them housing being created, but not actually livable places with a town centre and with the services that you expect from that. People happy to carry on having tech questions in the side. Lorna Wallace has asked a good question, which maybe is one for both of you, is how do you overcome the challenge of aspirations to create new town centres and green spaces in the time of cuts to public sector revenue budgets required to maintain them? Today, we're obviously having an exciting budget, which will no doubt depress us all as we leave this meeting. But I don't know if either of you have any observations on how we deliver this. And
I mean, Jonathan probably will be more au fait with that, but I mean, a lot of the parks that we had already were there, so there was no shortage of the green spaces and the opportunities to link these green spaces. There was just the condition of them was terrible, and they were just like inhospitable. So it was more finding ways of opening them up and making them people friendly. I realize there's money in that, but they've become so badly overgrown that these places, some of these spaces were, I mean, I won't go into it, but we're talking like areas that, you know, I don't even want to mention some of the words here, but just actually they need to be addressed. And I don't know how people calculate these things, but if the spaces are open to opportunity and where you can actually get exercise, then that in itself has a positive bearing on our wider kind of costs for the whole kind of city. So I can see Michael's got his hand up, and I think Michael will be probably better and more knowledgeable to answer that question than myself. So
yeah, I mean, I think probably jumping in to kind of rescue Chris slightly from that. What is a very complex question for us at the moment in terms of local government budgets. But one of the things that I think livable neighbourhoods, these plans and the other plans that we've been preparing for the kind of wider strategic areas, is it puts you in a position to be then able to bid for external funding, because a lot of our, you know, whether it's levelling up or city deal or place fund or other central government funding that becomes available, then, you know, if we've got these plans, then you're then in a very strong position to make bids for those funds. You know, livable neighbourhoods will hopefully come with a budget that allows us to do meet some of the aspirations, but also puts you in a strong position to say, you know, we've consulted with the local communities, we've got a plan in place, and we've got projects that are shovel ready, I think is the word that we like to use for these. So that although there's very little capital funding within, you know, said local government at the moment, what we do find increasingly is that there are opportunities to access other funding sources. So the plans put you in a good place for doing that. So yeah, I mean, none of us have got enough resources to do everything we want to do, but at least having a plan allows you to be in a strong position to make bids to try and deliver some of these projects. I mean, some of them have been aspirations for a long time. Parkhead Railway Station was in a strategy that we developed in the mid-2000s for this part of the world. So we keep, I don't think it's one we want to remove, because I think it is a worthwhile aspiration, and perhaps the metro or one of these big national projects will help us deliver that eventually. But yeah, I think just to, as I said, Chris is a consultant working for the local authority, so probably fairer that the local authority field that.
Answer the question.
Thank you, Michael.
But and I suppose it does touch back to, I suppose, one of the presentations given previously with Living Streets, who were doing some research in North Lanarkshire, which were basically looking at communities looking for their places to be maintained, actually not for anything new to be introduced to a community, but just for what they already have to be maintained well and obviously we seem to have gone through prolonged periods of them not being maintained. Jonathan, you had your hand up.
Yeah, I mean, to support what was said there about actually, if you get a plan, you've got your outline business case across multiple projects potentially, based on one a suite of mid-level basic. You'll still need detailed information on each specific plan beyond that, but at least everybody can access and use that, which is an effective of people's most important asset beyond their health. It's their time. The second thing I think is that you've got to ask yourself questions: can we afford not to do some of this stuff? So coming through the pandemic and its massive crisis has revealed actually what we need, and actually we need green space. There's a health imperative around an awful lot of this stuff. So instead of paying for expensive medication to treat people who get ill, why don't we focus on the stuff that's going to help them not get ill in the first place, which quite often we now know, and there's a building empirical evidence around this, is healthy green spaces as part of our built infrastructure. Mark Carney, former governor of the Bank of England, said quite rightly post-2008, society gets what it values. Now, we could debate that for a long time, but I think we need to ask questions of government and wider society. If you value these places, then yes, maintenance matters, and cutting to the bone in local authorities is not helpful. So I absolutely support that. I think communities, we should start with what's strong, not with what's wrong. But we do need to tackle some of those amazing green spaces and actually look after them. And our streets and public part, the whole public realm needs much, much more, because ultimately, I think if you want to reduce it to monetary value, we can save money doing it this way rather than spending it when it's too damaged.
Yeah. Interesting, because you both, I think, referred to this. Jonathan, you certainly did. Davina Lavery's coming up. Barbara Kerr's made an observation around community taking on the management of those green spaces, which I think we're aware of in a number of local authorities, and that's between communities and local authorities to come to that agreement without it, although it still costs money. But Davina Lavery is asking, how does the work in livable neighbourhoods overlap with preparation of local place plans? Now, Jonathan did refer to local place plans, and I see the delivery of 20-minute neighbourhoods being strongly connected with local place plans. I don't know, Chris, you had any comment on that?
Yeah, yes, no, one of the biggest groups that I worked with was the Kinning Park complex, and they're preparing a local place plan for not the whole of that area that we're looking at, but their half, if you like, and we worked really closely with them. And I think they're just I can't remember. We can. I think that's the name of their local place plan. And so I actually went on that. It was great benefit. So I went actually on about 5 urban walks with them around the kind of Kinning Park. Oh, because we say so, David Lee, that's right. Because we say so, that's right. I went on many a walk with them around the kind of area, and we actually did talk, and they joined in the kind of consultations that we had, and so they worked with us on the proposals that we came up with, and actually was very helpful because a lot of the kind of ideas actually they had already shovel ready, if you like, and some of them worked and some of them didn't for us. And for example, the ones around the Lawrence Street area, they had already been thinking about that, and they had already got some consultation with the local school, and they'd already got some consultation with the Orange Lodge, which happens to be in that area as well. So they were really, really helpful. So they were a huge asset. To actually coordinate with a local place plan that was ongoing was a huge positive for us. I don't know so many others in the northeast area. There wasn't many going on there that I was aware of, but that one we worked hand in hand with the Kinning Park complex on it. So yeah, there's Michael says that's the first local place plan to be developed in Glasgow. So we worked really, really closely with them. So yeah, they dovetailed together really, really well.
Okay. Oh, Jonathan.
Sorry, I did just come in. I mean, I think that our experience with this, and I know it's embedded in the legislation, even at sort of primary legislation stages, that it's really important that any one of these individual plans has a relationship with surrounding plans, and that's essentially what a framework does. It gives you an evidence base, it sees the bigger picture, and it helps to join people, in a neighbourly way. That means you can do individual plans, but they're coordinated. If we're being And we get tomatoes thrown at us all the time by the public saying, well, the council never join any of the dots up. The first thing you've got to do is map where the dots are, and it's better to do that collaboratively with them. And if they're going to take, anybody's going to take forward a local place plan singular, and each one of these plans can be pretty big. Railway stations are pretty big, new bridges over the Tay, pretty big, aspiration, which is a wonderful thing. But they have to have some understanding of that wider context to make them long-term deliverable and sustainable. And I come back to that. We can help at that framework scale to coordinate and map that, but that's exactly what they'll require to do. And I would say that actually, having gone through this process in North Perth, there's only one example. We have actually more cups of tea happening between those different communities, because diversity and community and difference is what we should be celebrating here. Have those differences, but also understand the things that you can share, and those shared assets, I think we can simplify. But just one final thing, sorry, on mapping. Actually, if we can map some of that vacant derelict land and bring that forward, these are smaller parcels of land that, in a changing understanding of streets and movement and perception, there are lots of gap sites which potentially could be used for urban agriculture, could potentially be used for small micro development sites. It could be transferred completely to local authorities, but it's understanding what it is that structure of a place is trying to do. And at the moment, that largely has been atomized by previous decision making over the last 50, 60, 70 years. I think we're realizing that now. So those are the opportunities, and it's heartening to hear Christopher talk about those, A, the aspirations, and B, the need to actually go back in and retrofit. Back to radical incrementalism. I think that's what we can do if we target that. So it's targeting resources well, and we do that best with doing exactly what Christopher's demonstrated, collaborating with local folks.
And initially, Because We Say So was presented at the very first meeting of this 20-minute neighbourhood network, because we were interested in a locally generated one, and obviously we will come back to them when it's complete. So they spoke at length about what their plans were and how they were going to engage the community, and also it's being an interesting, Kinning Park being an interesting place because it's a transport corridor. Is it a place? But for the community, it certainly is a place. So that is something that we will be coming back to, and it is the first one, as Michael has mentioned. Can I thank you both for the time that you've given, both in preparing the presentations today, Chris, you weathering through having a heavy cold, and obviously the questions that you've had are indicative of the level of interest that are in this. But thank you very much. And it also provides a nice segue for us to go and have a look very briefly at what 20-minute neighbourhoods look like in NPF4, which I will be sharing with you. So NPF4, the revised NPF4 came out, I think, on the 8th of November to be laid before Parliament. The Parliamentary Committee has had a look at it in 2 sessions. So NPF4 is obviously laid before Parliament. Parliament signs off on it. At this stage, it isn't amended. So the first draft version has been subject to amendments, and this is the amended version of 20-minute neighbourhoods within the National Planning Framework 4, which is the National Planning Framework to rule them all. It supersedes all other planning policy, or it will when Parliament adopts it, I believe, before Christmas. And this is the section on the left-hand side of this page is the one page on 20-minute neighbourhood, local living in 20-minute neighbourhoods, and it gives what will be used as a policy instrument in decision-making within the planning process. So this is in development planning, when there are new proposals going to happen somewhere, this is how the 20-minute neighbourhood looks. In looking back at what SURF's recommendations were on the draft, and what other organisations were in the draft, I suppose some of the criticisms of the earlier draft were trying to apply this concept across all of Scotland in both urban and rural contexts was maybe not the best way to do it. The government still has an intent to do that, but they've obviously changed the wording slightly to say that if you look at if I take my pointer, the approach should take into account the local context and consider the varying settlement patterns and reflect the particular characteristics and challenges faced by each place, which looks at rural Scotland not necessarily having to have all their services and all development within a 20-minute or a quarter mile or 800-metre radius. So there is an acknowledgement that there needs to be a different approach around that. But it also begins to look at the bullet point section of what is expected to be seen within a 20-minute neighbourhood. So that's about active travel, it's about employment, shopping, health and social care, schools, play, open space. And this just goes to show that lobbying works. Judy Wilkinson, congratulations, you got allotments, because it wasn't in the first version of this. Also in this definition, publicly accessible toilets has appeared, and affordable and accessible housing options, and the ability to age in place. And now within the NPF4, there is the links to the various different aspects of government policy and what this will contribute to. Just as a slight aside, I would say including public accessible toilets is a very high demand. They're very rare. So to have 20-minute neighbourhoods include them in a planning context is actually, I would say, quite a significant difference. If you live in an urban area, you'll know that they are rare. And also, I think if you'll know through lockdown, when a lot of places when cafes were shut, people became much more aware of the dearth of publicly accessible toilets. This definition may include cafes, but they're not the same as public toilets. The number of organisations recommended that there should be a link to density with 20-minute neighbourhoods in an urban setting. Our comparators are often Paris and Melbourne. Paris already is dense, very highly dense. And Melbourne, the agenda in Australia is to densify what are essentially very low density suburban areas. Density isn't referred to specifically within 20-minute neighbourhoods, but it's part of an agenda for compact urban growth, which does imply density. And in other sections of NPF4, density is referred to as something that would contribute to providing a demand for services, which is what you want to see within a 20-minute neighbourhood. And it's referred to, it's the fourth of the 6 qualities of successful places. Density is included within that. So density is implicit, but not explicit. And I suppose from my perspective, I would wonder how you would use this in a development management setting when you're looking at the growth of a settlement. Adding to a settlement, will this encourage higher density being proposed, or will it still enable fairly low density settlements to be created, new settlements to be created? And I suppose one of the things that you have to reflect on this is looking at new development where change is happening, but it will also impact on where we're maybe thinking about retrofitting. And I suppose if we're looking at retrofitting neighbourhoods, the qualities that are described here or the services that are described here are things that we would hope that other elements of local and national government would be considering when they are considering where they position schools, health services, or how they fund the funding for them works. So the left-hand side is the policy that will be used in development planning. The concept of 20-minute neighbourhoods is to sit within local development plans. And so it is a key plank of the future planning system. And the box on the right-hand side on 20-minute neighbourhoods is in the glossary at the end of NPF4, which again gives a definition of what would be expected to be seen within a 20-minute neighbourhood. One of my other observations would be, I think that it does contain a statement that there's a statement within NPF4 that 20-minute neighbourhoods can help reduce inequalities in health. And I think a number of you were at our previous meeting where Jonathan Olson presented from Glasgow University about research they were doing, which was GIS research looking at the services that you would expect to see within a 20-minute neighbourhood and mapping them over SIMD areas. He's now produced a very, very detailed map which can be broken down by postcode. And what that reveals is that the places that have the most services are also the places with the poorest health outcomes. So they are the most deprived areas. So his analysis is that the most deprived areas of Scotland are the closest to 20-minute neighbourhood developed places that we have, which obviously brings in bigger questions. And actually what's interesting is if you look on his website. There's a link on our website to his research, and I'll pop it in the chat as well. If you click on the areas with the highest health outcomes, they are not 20-minute neighbourhoods. Rich people don't need 20-minute neighbourhoods, which we would like them to have because they create the highest amount of pollution. But the connection between 20-minute neighbourhoods and health probably needs further exploration. And I think some of the conversations we've had in the presentations today around this was antisocial behaviour. Antisocial behaviour often happens for deeper reasons than urban form. And we can mitigate some antisocial behaviour, aspects of antisocial behaviour, but if the drivers for them remain, then they will possibly displace them. So there's an element of what is their expectation around 20-minute neighbourhoods. They are a good thing to have there because to me it's good. You know, I can get rid of the 20-minute neighbourhood and just say it's good planning. But what we expect to be delivered for this, we maybe need to think carefully about what that will mean. In the delivery plan for the NPF4, two things maybe of note. What many people have said is that there needs to be further detail on 20-minute neighbourhoods for planners to be able to use it in the planning process, and guidance is being prepared. You can see that there's being prepared by government, and there'll be a public consultation following the laying of NPF4 as it is just now, and hopefully produced in 2020. Well, it says it will be considered and finalised in 2023. I'm saying hopeful because I'm being realistic, but hopefully that will happen. Hopefully this network can be part of that. We have already invited the Scottish Government to come and talk to us about 20-minute neighbourhoods within the context of this. And one other aspect is that Designing Streets, a document which exists quite a long time, is also being revised, but in the 24 to 28 time period. Interesting comment, I've just opened the chat box. Is Eugene's comment is positive that public toilets have been included. I would agree it is positive, but it's one that requires substantial support for delivery, as many things within the 20-minute neighbourhood concept are. There are things that planning can kind of look to have, but the people who deliver them, whether or not that's public transport or health services, it's not the planning system that determines that in itself. It can provide some form of guidance. And so what is important about the 20-minute neighbourhood concept is that it does not remain a planning issue, and that through the place principle is adopted wide across Scottish Government and across local government as well, so that their considerations and their future funding, but obviously, and the private sector as well, because they are delivering retail within all places. It's not the government that provides retail, and having access to affordable food, obviously is highlighted at present with inflation at 10%, is something that the private sector deliver, which the government have maybe currently less control of. I will stop sharing my screen. But that's where it currently sits with NPF4, and it would be interesting to see what further guidance. There is a lot more guidance to come out of it. Other organisations have given, I suppose, their response to the delivery mechanisms for this and the funding of NPF4, which are of interest. That both the RTPI and the heads of planning have also expressed disappointment that the NPF4 can't be amended any further, and that what we see now is what we will get in National Planning Framework 4. But that provides a context for further decision making outside of planning across Scotland in the future. So that's a brief update on NPF4. As I've said, the 20-minute neighbourhood is a requirement for both local development plans. It's also a requirement within the regional spatial strategies, which are kind of centred around the city region deals and what formerly was the strategic planning authorities. So it is embedded across a range of statutory bodies and statutory decision making. So it's not going away. Making it successful is going to be down to not me, but it's going to be down to people bringing forward development that conforms to 20-minute neighbourhoods. And I suppose if there are any development anybody working in development management on the call. It would be interesting to, if they had any thoughts on whether or not the policy as it stands is one that they will be useful to them, not just to encourage developers to bring forward schemes that conform to 20-minute neighbourhoods, but that would give them the power to stop a development that doesn't conform to the principles found within successful places or within 20-minute neighbourhoods. But that's maybe something that we can discuss at another time. I'm happy to take any questions on it if anyone has. I mean, it might be observations that people have, but I would also say that one of the things that we are keen to see is we've had presentations today from 2 local authorities, and local authorities are going to be crucial in delivering 20-minute neighbourhoods or helping shape them. But we're very interested to hear from local community groups that are working on this. I think I would imagine that the automatic way to do this is if you're thinking about a local place plan. Local place plans aren't heavily referred to within the NPF4, but obviously they have a statutory footing, and there's still guidance on that, and there is the creation of a place builder to be used in community engagement, referred to again in the delivery plan for NPF4. So there, it looks like there is more coming, which will be helpful to communities. But if you are aware of any communities, we have been given some recommendations which we're following up. But in the new year, we'll be looking to have another meeting of the network, but looking at maybe a more community-focused one, as well as inviting the Scottish Government back to present on the formation of the guidance and then maybe the consultation of the guidance. And the other thing that I said I would share with you is Jonathan Olson's research, which I would highly recommend everyone has a look at, because it reveals things that are I'm not able to share. I'm somehow trapped in direct messaging within the chat, and I can't seem to. Emma, if you could find the Jonathan Olson piece, you could share it with him, that would be super. But I think that draws to a close. We said we'd finish at 12 o'clock today. It's 3 minutes to 12. Thank you very much for your contributions to the questions that people have provided, but more importantly, to Jonathan and Chris for the time that they have given to our meetings today. And as I won't see you all again, I would wish everyone a good Christmas and a happy New Year when it comes. And I hope everyone enjoys the well-earned break. Thank you.
Thank you.